Universitas Diponegoro. Ya. Kemudian untuk hari ini akan ada 2 pembicara, 2 speaker, ya. Jadi ada Ana, kemudian ada Bu Witri di sini, sehingga dalam kesempatan ini walaupun Bu Witri hadir, ya, tetapi sambutan diserahkan kepada saya. Jadi tidak enak ya, udah jadi pembicara, jadi yang menyambut juga, rasanya menyambut diri sendiri itu agak berbeda gitu. Terima kasih kesempatannya untuk saya membuka kali ini. Untuk adik-adik mahasiswa, ya gunakan kesempatan ini sebagai media untuk belajar lebih banyak. Jadi kita perhatikan bahwa ilmu itu bisa diperoleh di mana saja, jadi bukan hanya dari dosen-dosen di dalam begitu ya, tapi kita membuka wawasan yang lebih luar, ada apa ini dengan pengukuran yang dilakukan di luar sana. Karena kalau kita lihat di Indonesia saja, budaya pengukuran, budaya penelitian itu bisa sangat bervariasi. Jadi jangan kita strict begitu ya, hanya pada satu sudut pandang begitu, tapi kita bisa membuka diri untuk mempelajari sesuatu dengan lebih baik begitu. Untuk Bapak Ibu dosen yang sudah hadir di sini juga terima kasih, tidak bisa saya sebutkan satu persatu. Kemudian banyak hal di sini, Bu Witri terima kasih karena juga selain dosen pengukuran juga yang mengajak narasumber, kemudian juga yang memfasilitasi dan sebagainya. Jadi kita memang harus penuh semangat untuk setiap kegiatan di Fakultas Psikologi. Itu saja dari saya, karena di sini ada 2 pembicara, pasti akan ada banyak materi yang bisa kita dapatkan. Mohon keaktifan dari mahasiswa begitu ya, untuk bisa turut berpartisipasi dalam menambah wawasan ini. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Bu Dr. Novi Ponitantin sudah membuka kegiatan pada pagi hari ini. Selanjutnya akan saya serahkan kepada Ibu Dian Ratna Sawitri yang pada hari ini sebagai speaker dan juga sebagai moderator sekaligus. Gitu. Kami serahkan langsung kepada Ibu Dian Ratna Sawitri untuk selanjutnya melanjutkan kegiatan pada pagi hari ini. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih, Anna. I will be your moderator for today.
Thank you.
So, I would like to introduce Anna to our audience. Terima kasih untuk Bapak Ibu semua, Bapak Ibu dosen yang sudah hadir pada pagi hari ini dan adik-adik mahasiswa semua, serta tamu dari luar Fakultas Psikologi. So, the audience for today is not only from the Faculty of Psychology, but we have also alumni and also several guests from outside Undip and also outside the Faculty of Psychology of Universitas Diponegoro. Anna is my friend when I was doing my PhD at Griffith University, Australia. So I was there in 2010 to 2013 and we share working office together and we share also primary supervisor together. And we have similar interests in career development, especially in adolescent and young adults, and also we share interest also in skill development area. So today, Anna would like to share her experience in developing skill, and later I will also share several experience of doing or developing my skills. Maybe you are very interested right now because you are now in the psychological measurement subject. Yeah. So I think Anna, the time is yours. Please present your slides. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. I will try to share my screen. Okay. Can we see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you
clear.
very much. Okay, so welcome everyone. I am Anna Prashkova and I would like to, welcome you from a sunny Queensland in Australia where I work within a Southern Cross University. So all of these colors are all Southern Cross University colors. I also include here my email on a screen just in case that some of you might want to ask me some questions after this lecture. So including these. Now in Southern Cross University, I teach mainly statistics and research methods units, and I also supervise honors students doing their fourth-year research projects, and I'm always happy to take on PhD students. So who knows, maybe I will see one of you one day in the future. So these ones are the topics I would like to cover today. So I thought that we will start with some really basics of psychological measurement before I take you through the key steps in scale development. And I will also give you some key resources to read if you are interested later on. Then I will finish with an example of scale development. So how I applied those steps in scale development when I was devising scale as part of my PhD, where I was studying with Ri. And then we will finish with a Q&A session. So hopefully there will be some time left for some of your questions. So let's start with our topic number 1, psychological measurements basics. Well, when we think of psychological scales or psychological instruments, they measure psychological constructs, things that cannot be seen, things that cannot be touched, because they represent something which is quite abstract. Some of those constructs you see on the screen, such as life satisfaction, life meaning, or academic stress. Now, they are not objective constructs as when you are measuring a body temperature or a speed of walking. We cannot easily measure these constructs by just asking one question or expect you to answer it with one answer, because that's something more abstract. Now let's start with this life satisfaction. If I ask you one question, how happy are you with your life? It will be quite difficult for you to answer, because there are many aspects to life. Now, you might be happy with some aspects of your life and less happy with other aspects of life. So it would not be fair for me to ask you one question and expect one answer. I would need to use some measurement or some instrument that will ask you about various aspects of your life, about your family life, work life, leisure life, your study life. Okay, and we call these measurements multi-item scales. Now, in this screen, you can see example of multi-item scale, which was devised by Steger and his colleagues back in 2006. It's called Meaning in Life Scale. Now, this scale consists of 10 items, and they are assessing different aspects of meaning in life, specifically the presence of meaning in life and a search for meaning in life. And those items are reflecting these aspects of life. Now, you can see that they are mostly positively worded. I understand my life meaning. But look at the item number 9. It is a negatively worded item. My life has no clear purpose. And so some of those multi-item scales can have both positive and negative items. Now, we can also see that people are typically asked to respond on a number of options. So here, for example, from 1, absolutely untrue, to 7, absolutely true. So the key principles of multi-item psychological scales is to create individual items that reflect this psychological construct, something which is quite abstract and latent. Make sure that each item will reflect different aspects of that construct, and then when together, they would represent the construct as a whole. And then we would also add some response option for the respondents to answer, such as from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. Now, because those constructs are abstract, this would be our attempt to convert this information from the items into numbers so that we can better analyze and assess the data and in a more reliable and valid way. And so these ones are the purpose of having psychological scales, because they allow us to measure our construct in a more reliable and valid way. Now, if we have got a scale of a construct, we can do more research on that construct. And with that, we will also gain more evidence. And if we have got a results and evidence, then we can take those and translate them into practice, such as when we want to devise different psychological interventions that are based on evidence. And that's why we do psychological scales. Now, Do we always need to, I guess, devise a new scale? Well, no. We don't have to always devise new scale. If there is already existing scale, they just might need a little bit more work to improve it. Or if we want to modify the scale to better suit our sample or at context. Or sometimes there is a scale that is too long and we want to shorten it, make a brief version of the scale, or vice versa. Okay, so that's enough in terms of the basic of psychological measurements. Let's have a look at those key steps to scale development. Some of you might want to develop psychological scales in your future studies. Now, today, very brief summary, because I could really talk about scale development for days. There is so many things to consider. So today, very, very brief summary. These are the steps, so I summarize them into key 10 steps. Starting with identification of that construct, the thing that we want to measure, all the way down to reporting the results of the scale development exercise. So let's have a look at these. Step number 1, identify a psychological construct for which you want to develop a new scale. Now, if you cannot define your psychological construct, then it is impossible for you to be able to know how to measure it. Okay? So here on a screen, you can see some examples of psychological constructs. They can be grouped into those big categories. So it might include abilities, it might include personality, distress, depression. Also, we might have a psychological construct including emotions, happiness, satisfaction, our attitudes and opinions, as well as interests. We might have a curious interest or interest being alone. Right? So we need to figure out what it is that we want to measure. Now, the next step would be to conduct a literature review and trying to find out if there is already existing measure of that construct developed. Now, if you find that there is already suitable existing measure of the construct, then you have to stop there. There is no point in devising a new scale if there is one available. So key to a scale development is really assuring yourself that you need a new psychological scale. You need to justify it. Otherwise, it would be quite expensive and time-consuming process. So once you have a construct in mind for which you want to develop a new scale, then probably next stage is to go into literature and really trying to figure out how you can define that construct. And you might find out that there may be multiple definitions to a construct. And so the key is to find out all the potential definitions and elements of the definitions and the construct so that you don't miss any. Based on this typically big literature review on the construct, you may decide on your own definition. So you may just create your own, or you might adopt one of those definitions that you locate in a literature. You might also decide to synthesize all the existing definitions or use some combination of both. Now, in this exercise and through this reading, you might find out that a construct that you are interested in may be quite simple construct, which could be measured by a small number of items that represents that abstract. Now, that would be an example of a unidimensional scale, or what we call first order scale. But through your reading, you might find out that your construct is quite complex and might have lots of little elements and domains that make up this construct. In this case, you would be dealing and hoping to develop a multidimensional scale where, for example, you might want to devise 5 items that represent 3 different domains of that construct. And let's move on to step 2. So we have got a construct and we defined it. We also, during this exercise of reading, we might need to start and notice what is not part of the construct, but may be related to our construct either theoretically, empirically, or conceptually. And this is what we call Nominological Net, which identifies or specifies the external relationship between our construct and what is surrounded theoretically related constructs. And a Nominological net can include all sorts of things, the antecedents, consequences, correlate, as well as similar or dissimilar constructs. You can just draw a Nominological net, like the one you see here on a screen. This is an example of construct called self-esteem, or it's often is called self-worth. This construct, through reading, I may find that it's related to other constructs, such as ability to cope or school achievement. Now, if I draw and put my construct in a middle, then I can send lines outside of this circle and link these to those related or unrelated constructs. And we can even identify how each of those constructs should be related with our construct of self-esteem. So, for example, we might predict that self-esteem will be positively related to ability to cope and school achievement, yet we would expect a negative correlation between self-esteem and distracting friends and authoritative parenting. In this example, you can see a little bit more comprehensive Nominological net of a psychological construct called goal orientation. So we can see the construct here in a circle, the goal orientation with its 3 domains. So learning, proof, and avoid performance would be a domains or aspects that make up a construct of goal orientation. Now, these domains represent the internal relationship of the goal orientation construct. Now, these other 3 boxes represent constructs that are theoretically related to goal orientation. So the constructs in these boxes represent the external relationships with goal orientation. Now, later on, we might pick some of those constructs to include in a survey because we would be able to use these as we want to validate our scale. So now we would have defined our construct and we would really clarify what is part of our construct internally and what would sit outside of the construct, those external relationships. So now we can start to plot some of this information on what we call test specification. So test specification is just a blueprint that we use to help us generate items. Already said, it specifies the internal relationship of the construct of our interest. So test specification would typically be presented in a table, in a grid pattern, where we would include all the domains, or sometimes it's called content areas of our construct. But we would also plot how each of those domains or contents manifest, how these areas become apparent. Now, typically they may be apparent in behaviors, those activities that we do. They may also manifest in emotions, so the way how we feel about a construct. And they may also be manifested through cognitions or thoughts that we have about a construct. Now, in this stage, we also have to think about whether some of those domains may be more important than others. And if that's the case, we may assign those domains higher weights. This is very important because based on the information that we include in this test specification, we will then generate items that fully reflect this test specification. And it is important as it suggests how many items we should generate based on this test specification. Now, test specification is also a base for our ability to demonstrate that we have got a content validity in our scale. And this is something I will talk throughout the lecture. In this example, we have got test specification for the construct of self-esteem. Now, from reading in the literature, it might suggest that this construct is comprising of 3 main domains: competence, achievement, and feedback. Now, through reading, I might find out that competence and feedback seems to be more important than achievement. And so I assign those 2 domains high weights, 40% and 40%, while the achievement gets 20. Now, these weights need to add up to 100%. Now, I might also list how each of those 3 domains manifest. So, for example, in competence, it might manifest through the competence across task A, task B, and task C. Achievements might manifest through different ways as well: social achievement, school achievement, or meeting personal goals. In terms of feedback, can also manifest through different ways, through feedback from parents, friends, or teachers. Now, like the domains, we can also assign weights to each of the manifestations. Now, if there is no reason that one manifestation should be more important than the others, we can just assign equal weights, or we can make them uneven. Now, the key reason for the test specification is to identify all areas of the construct so that we measure the construct as a whole without missing any important part to the construct. Now, the other purpose is to help us figure out how many items we need to generate. Now, based on these weights, in this test specification, we would generate 25 items across those 3 domains. The number of items that we generate for our scale will also depend on other things. So firstly, the number of the domains and the content areas that we have. Obviously, the more aspects the construct has, the more items we need to develop. It will also depend as to what is the purpose for our test. Are we just after very brief screening measure of a construct, and so we can get away with just a few items? Or are we trying to devise more comprehensive knowledge or diagnostic scale, which will need to be more comprehensive and longer? Also, if we are devising scale for children, we might want to devise shorter, briefer scale so that they don't get tired, rather than with adults who can get away with longer scale. Now, what we need to remember is that we need to generate about 2 to 3 times that many items into our test specification than you would then end up in the final scale. Because throughout the process of scale development, you will then start to delete some of those items to come up to your best set of items for your final scale at the end. Definitely, if your item or your scale is multidimensional, has got different domains, then you should end up with at least 3 items per each domain. But more ideally, you should aim for 4 to 5. Okay, so now we have got a construct, we have got a test specification, we know how many items we need to generate. So the next step is to generate some good items. So you generate items based on the test specification that you have, where every domain and every manifestation must be represented by at least some items, and so that they represent the whole universe of items for the construct. That's important for achieving content validity. Now, it might be that you write all your own items. Now, everyone can write some items, but it is actually more difficult than it appears to be able to write good items. Now, every good item should be an item that is very specific, has got a good enough detail so the participants can tell what we want them to respond on. These items should also be as simple as possible and with lots of clarity, so there is no confusion in responding. We could also take items from existing scales. So often we just borrow items and we might update them or reword them to make them more suitable to our sample. Now, it's nothing wrong about doing that, but what we have to do is always acknowledge the authors of the original scale. Sometimes we also do focus groups or interviews with a small sample that represent the population, just to listen for the specific wording and phrasing that they use when they talk about specific construct, because it can generate ideas on how to word those items. Now we know how the good item should look, should be simple and clear. So I thought that let's talk about some of the problematic items. So there are quite a few. Sometimes we see items that may be double-barreled. Now, what it means that the item that we create may have more than one message in them, more than one idea, often conflicting ideas as well. So if I say, I consider myself kind and reliable, we have got two ideas in there. But consider that some participants may consider themselves kind, but not reliable. Right? So they would find it quite difficult to answer to a question like this. And so the best way is to split that item into two separate items. We also want to avoid complex and overly long items or questions because they make reading too difficult. Often they may confuse our participants. Also, they become just easily tired if we are asking them to read very long and complex questions. Specific to adults, we should be targeting reading level of about year 8 or year 9, but nothing beyond. It would probably become a little bit too complex. The other problematic item are ambiguous items. So these items lack clarity at all. It's not clear what we are asking, and so respondents might not respond accurately to those items. Sometimes we see leading questions. So these ones are suggestive questions that imply their own answer. In a way, how we word the item, it leads the respondents to give us a certain answer. And that's not good because it would be very subjective. We have to word items in a way that are the most objective as possible. Or we can't create items that may be too informal or maybe too sensitive to answer by our participants or even offensive. So we have to be careful that our items that have got a style and a little bit of formality. The last issue I want to talk about are items that may be too repetitive. So that's what we call redundancy. When we have got items in our scale that are too similar to one another. Now that's an issue because it will artificially inflate the associations between our items and also inflate our scale reliability. That's an issue. Now it's okay to have similar items in the initial pool of items, because through the scale development, we will weed some of those items out to make sure that we don't have a redundancy in items in our final scale. But for the initial pool of items, that's okay. So now I thought I would show you some of the examples of bad items and with the suggestions of improved items. Now these ones are obviously written in English language, but tell you the first one would be quite difficult for an English speaking person to even digest, to be able to read it. It is because the sentence is very complex, too complicated, even long. So we would not like a question like this. It would tire our respondents. It's better to make it a little bit less complex, less complicated. It is also a leading question because of that first part of the sentence. I believe it is preposterous. It assumes a level of subjectivity and leading participants to agree with it. And so that's not good. The second item, just looking at it, is short, and that's what we want, a short item. But would you believe it also has got issues? So it includes words that are quite ambiguous. The meaning of it might be misunderstood by different respondents. The word grounded is quite ambiguous. It can be rewritten very simply by saying, I feel calm at times of stress. That would be kind of a more clear way to say what grounded actually means. Now, the third item, without even reading it, suggests that the item is way too long. So the aim should be to create items that don't exceed 20 words in length. I could just rewrite and improve the same question without really losing any idea of message, making it half the length. Now the fourth item is also a poor item with several issues. So when I look in the mirror, I see myself as fat and ugly. So the first thing is that it's quite offensive. We should not write item that is offensive or inappropriate in any way. The other issue is that it's a double barrel. So that means this fat and ugly are two different messages. We might have a participant who feel themselves being fat but not ugly, and vice versa. So again, this is not appropriate. It's offensive and can be rewritten quite simply as, I do not like what I see in the mirror. So I'm sure the same issues would be in Indonesian language as you are creating good and unproblematic items. Okay, so we have good items. Now we have to select suitable response format. So when we have got a question, each question should have a stem or the item, and then should have the response, some kind of format that is used by participants to respond to our item. And the key there is that the stem and the response have to match. Now, there are many response formats out there to choose from, and it's important to know because different response formats will generate different types of data. And based on the data that you have, it will then flow into the analysis that you can do with the data. So I included here reference to Kriazos and Stalikas, which is actually a really nice article with excellent summary about the consideration you need to take when you select a response option. And it also offers different examples of scales and response formats as well. So if you ever need to develop a scale, that is a really good reference for you. So I will just look very briefly at the most commonly used scales in psychology, and will specifically focus on subjective psychological tests. When we cannot measure psychological construct in that objective, visible way, and so we create subjective structured questions or items, and we ask participants to answer it using some response format. So here I would like to just cover those two first, dichotomous and polychotomous response format. If we are giving participants a statement or a question, and we only give them two alternatives to choose from, that would be example of dichotomous response format. So when at home, I prefer to check my social media or interact with family. I'm just giving an option one of two, dichotomous response format. If we have got more than two alternatives, we would call these polychotomous scales. And this would be your typical multiple choice question, where we have got a question followed with several options. How much effort did you put into writing your resume? And you can pick from no effort, minimal effort, some effort, or substantial effort. Probably the most commonly used scale in psychology are called Likert type scales. Now, they typically have anywhere between 5 to 9 response options, and that would be up to question or a statement. And I provide here example for both. The first one would be a statement. I am in pain today. And here the respondents can answer or choose from 1 strongly disagree to 7 strongly agree. The other example is the example of question. So how often are you in pain? And here the respondent answer from 1, never, to 6, all the time. The key here is that our item flows naturally to the response options that we give. It just makes sense. There are more options. You might also see or consider using visual analog scales. If you do research with children, for example, that can't read, for them, faces might be more suitable. Also, scales like these are good for people with language difficulties or with some cultural groups or people that who speak different language to for whom the language is a second language, such as refugees or migrants. Also, these scales are very good with people that may be in pain or distress, for whom just expressing this verbally may be difficult. You might also see scale where the researchers will identify item and will create two extremes of the item. So just I hate being on the doll to I like being on the doll. And then just give participants a few options to choose from in between. Typically 5 or 6 options, that's what we see. Now, more and more commonly, we see the use of sliders, like that last one here. Specifically here, a question, how satisfied are you currently with your life overall? And here respondents will just shift the slider anywhere from 0, not at all satisfied, to 100, completely satisfied. So I know that the respondents actually quite like this slider, they use the slider. And so bring this all together. If you need to create a Likert type scale, there are 3 things that you have to consider or include. Firstly, you will need some instructions for participants. So please select the number on a scale that best indicates the extent you agree or disagree that. So that would be called a stem, followed by an item. A nuclear power plant should be built in Indonesia. And then we have to give a suitable response format, such as here from 1, I strongly disagree, to I strongly agree with that item. The key there is that the stem, that the item, and the response formats, they must match. There may be nice natural flow. Now, this example is just the same, but rather than just using stem, we just give instructions followed with the item and then followed with the response option. Now, when we create Likert type scales, we also have to consider how many response formats or options we should give to our participants. So classically, the more options we give, it will allow for greater differentiated responses from our participants. So greater gradation or differentiation. Now, I said with adults, typically 5 to 9 points would be used. If we have got children, 5 to 9 points may be too many. They are not so skilled to differentiate their responses that well. And so 3 or 4 points for children may be okay. With this, we also need to think about that dreaded middle point. Are we going to keep that middle, undecided, neutral, no opinion option, or are we going to take it out? So are we going to have a response format which is odd numbered or evenly numbered? Now, people that may be having less intense attitudes on a subject, or they may have limited interest in a subject, they may just want to pick this middle point. But sometimes we have people that just don't want to answer the question that we give them, and so they go for the middle point. So sometimes it makes sense to take that middle point out and to help the participants work a little bit harder to get them decide on the answer. Now, really, when we look at the evidence, there is not much difference in our data if we do or don't include that middle point. But I think the latest suggestion is to include one. So now we have got a question and we have picked a response option. So the next step, step 6, is to conduct expert reviews. And we do it just to make sure that all our items are truly good items, and then they truly represent that construct and the domains. So it is a key to content validity. So in this step, we might ask experts to review all our items and give a ratings, or how adequate those items are, how adequately they tap that construct or the domain. Typically, you will see a scale ranging from 0, not at all adequate, to 4, very adequate. Now, how that works is that we would get the expert reviews ratings back, and we would typically retain only items that received high scores, 3 or 4 on that scale. We can also use the ratings to quantify it and to create something what we call content validity index. Now, this is something that you can always report in a scale development paper. Typically, we aim anywhere between 6 or 10 experts to review your item, and I would say pick carefully and be smart, because if you get really good experts, they will be able to offer you with good comments and also even improved wordings for your items. On the screen, you can see an extract from one of those expert review documents. So here we have got a domain called relationships with peers. Then it would follow with the item stem. I see myself as someone who, and then it would be a list of the different items that we would create. And we get experts to rate each of those items. So I see myself as someone who gets on well with my friends. So I think this expert would probably circle 3 or 4, because it seems that this item seemed to reflect the domain of relationships with peers and also flows nicely from the stem. However, item 32 is not that good. Now, if you read it, it still reflects some friendships. So it may be an appropriate item to reflect the domain. But this item doesn't flow naturally from the stem. I see myself as someone who, when I get across, it doesn't make sense. So this item would probably get quite low ratings or suggestion from the experts to this item be rewritten so it follows nicely from the stem. So I said that we can use the ratings to also calculate content validity index. So that would then measure the degree to which the scale has got an adequate or appropriate sample of items that reflect that construct which we want to measure. Now we can calculate this index for all individual items as well as for the overall scale. In the individual items, we would just look at the proportion of experts rating that item as content valid, those scores of 3 or 4. So if we have got 6 experts and 4 of them gave a score of 3 or 4, then the content validity index for that item would be 0.67. For the overall scale, we are just out the proportion of items on a scale that were judged as content valid by all of the experts. So here, and as an example, if we have got 80 items and 77 of them would be deemed content valid by expert review, so they would get a rating of 3 or 4, then you would get the index 0.96. Now, these indices would just be quite meaningless. It is just a number. So we need some benchmark to interpret them. And there are quite a few, but I have actually found out this recent paper by Yusuf, and you have got the reference here, who have summarized all the guidelines and came up with this table of acceptable content validity indices values based on the number of experts that we have. And so if you develop a scale in the future, you might actually find this article very useful as you're trying to interpret the content validity of your scale. Moving on, based on the expert review, we might either delete some items or we might reword some items, or just keep the good ones. So we might actually lose some items already based on expert review. The next step is pilot testing. Now, piloting is a must step to do before collecting the data from the large sample, because you want to make sure that your survey works as intended. This pilot testing, and typically this is done with just very small sample of representative population or sample, typically about 10% of a final sample size, so very small sample size. You can use these to identify all sorts of errors with your survey. It may highlight issues with readability, issues with clarity of instructions or the items, with the relevance of the items to the sample, as well as timing. So how long does it actually take to complete that survey? It can also identify things like grammar errors and typos. Also, if we have got a messy survey layout that may be quite confusing to the participants. And also, we can just ask our piloters wherever we think that the items appear to measure that construct of interest. So this is tapping into something called face validity. We will talk about it later. We can use piloters to demonstrate face validity. Now, once we complete the pilot testing and we are happy how the questions and the instructions are set up, then we will generate questionnaire. Now, this questionnaire will include those items that we generated after the expert review. We typically also add some demographic questions asking about gender and age, for example. And then we also add a number of scales that we will use later to demonstrate construct validity of our scale. Now, in terms of administration, most common type of administration is to do it online through online survey. But we still see surveys that are done through pen and paper or even through a phone administration. Now, through online survey administration, typically we use websites such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, where we set up the survey and send it out to people through emails. So now that is the time to collect data from a large sample that would be representative yet heterogeneous of the population for whom the scale is intended. So what does it mean? Well, if we want to devise academic satisfaction scale, then we need to find a sample that is representative, that means university students. And now to make the sample more heterogeneous, then we would have to recruit students from across different universities. If we want to devise job satisfaction scale, then our representative sample would be working adults. And to make the sample more heterogeneous, we will have to draw our sample from across different organizations. Now, in terms of sample size, really the larger, the better when it comes to scale development. With larger samples, we will have less measurement errors, and also we will achieve results which are more stable and more generalizable results. You can see some guidelines, and some of them are quite outdated. So Nunnally back in 1978 suggested for every item that we have, we should have 10 participants. Now, what it means that if we create 60 items, then we should aim for 600 participants. It's a very large sample size. And so there are other guidelines that you can follow as well. Now, just looking at those guidelines, it seems that the absolute minimum sample size for kind of the initial screening and factor analysis would be something about 200, sample size of 200. But really, the more magical number for initial scale development and factor analysis seems to be the number of 300. And also, look, Comrie would suggest that if we have got a sample size of 300, that we have got a good scale development process. Okay, so now we sorted our sample size and we administered the survey to a large population. We collect our data and we download the data if we administer it online. So now the next step would be to start exploring each individual item statistically. So the key of item reduction analysis, the step number 8, would be to reduce our items to a much smaller selection of the best possible items for your final scale. Now, there are a range of techniques that you can use to help you identify items that are good and you should keep, or items that are poor and you need to delete them. And when you have a look at those statistical techniques, they are actually using quite simple statistical procedures. Now, whilst you use your statistical techniques to reduce your items, you also need to always look at the items that you are left with, so that at the end, you maintain the full coverage across all the domains as you set for yourself in the test specification. So now let's have a look at some of the data reduction techniques. Let's start with looking at item distribution. Now, ideally, we want items in our final scale to have good distribution of scores. That means scores across all the range of our options, distribution that are either normally or rectangularly distributed, and also identify the poor one, such as very skewed distribution or distributions or items which show very little or no variability in response options. Typically, we look at histograms to identify poor item distribution. Now, this is a distribution of one item which has been scored on a 7-point scale from 1 to 7. Now, I am very happy because I see that responders have selected all across the response option. We are not having any response option missing. The other good news that we are having this nice curved line, which suggests that this item has got a normal item distribution or score distribution. This is a good item, one to keep. Now, this is an item which show rectangular distribution. So we don't see the nice natural curve. Instead, we see a rectangular. Now, this is actually not a bad item because it just tells us that our participants scored across all of those options evenly. This is a good item. Obviously, we don't want too many of these, but some of those are okay to keep. Now, this last histogram is showing a distribution of scores for item where most participants just scored 1 or 2 on the response option. Hardly anyone selecting options 3 to 7. So we are looking at floor distribution, a very skewed distribution. This is not a good item to keep because it doesn't give us discrimination across scores. We would probably delete this item. Now, when it comes to other techniques, we can also evaluate each item based on wherever they are biased. So we can evaluate the fairness of the score for participants across different groups. And you can see some of the groups on a screen: race, gender, age, physical attractiveness, and so on. We are trying to find any item that may be suspected from this bias, where the item produces a discrepancy between scores on members of the different groups, males and females, old and young. What happens in those items that some of the members of the group, they respond differently to the item, not because there is a true difference based on that group, but because the item is written in a way that treats those members of different groups unfairly. And obviously, if we have got lots of items that are biased, then we would generate a scale that is also biased, and that's why we need to tackle it. Now, we can test individual items for differences across groups of interest quite easily. And for example, if I want to look at a gender bias in our items, I want to find out whether males and females may respond differently to an item. Now, how do I find out? Easily. I can just run independent samples t-test, where I will have my gender group as an independent variable, and then I will use scores for all the items as my dependent variable. And then when I run the t-test, if I find that any of those items find statistically significant results, so I find a significant gender effect on any of those items, then this would be a problematic item, and I might want to delete that item. Now, another quite simple techniques that you can use to identify poor items are correlations, and there are two types. The first one are inter-item correlations. So I want each item in my scale to measure what other items are measuring. So I expect they should be related to one another. Now, if I find an item that is not correlating, not related with any of the other items, I would say they are not pulling its weight, then this item is not measuring what the other items are measuring, and we would delete that item. Now, the other purpose of inter-item correlation is to find out whether all the items are contributing uniquely to the whole scale. So we want all items to be quite unique without being redundant with any other items. So how can I find out? Very easily, I can run Pearson's correlations, where I correlate all items with every other item. Then I can just look at a correlation matrix that is produced and look for a correlation. What would be expected to see between those items? Typically, you would expect those correlations will be all positive and will be at least moderate to strong. I can find problematic items if I find very low or no correlation of one item with all the other ones. This might indicate that this item is just not measuring what every other item is measuring. We could delete that item. On the other hand, if we find very high correlations of one item with other items, so I mean talking about 0.8 or 0.9 correlations, this might indicate that this item is redundant with other items. That means the wording is so similar that they are assessing the same thing. So if this is the case, we would typically have to remove one of those redundant items, just keep one. Now, the other type of correlation that we typically use to identify poor items are item total correlation. So the promise is that each item in our scale should measure what the overall test is measuring. If we find an item that it's not correlating with our overall test, this would indicate that this item is not part of the scale, and we would delete that item. We can again just run simple Pearson's correlations between our items and the test score as an overall test score. If any of those items show low correlation, they would suggest that these items are poor and need to be deleted. Now, the analysis that would follow typically is called exploratory factor analysis. Now, we would run factor analysis to really get some insight into the dimensionality of the scale. So if by theory and our test specification suggest that we have 3 domains in our scale, then we analyze data using factor analysis to confirm where statistically we actually see those 3 dimensions or something else. That's one purpose of factor analysis. The other purpose is that we can use it for further item reductions. There are different criteria that you can see on a screen that we use to reduce our data to our final scale. Now, I understand that these ones are more advanced statistical procedures that you would not probably have heard before, and so I won't go into this in detail here. But the key is there that we use this analysis to reduce our data to come up with a beautiful final scale for our construct. And hopefully at the end, we have got at least 3 items in each of the factors or domains. Now, this analysis would then typically continue into something called confirmatory factor analysis, and this will be done typically with a new sample. Right, let's move to step number 9. So now we have got a final scale based on this analysis. So now is the time to test their psychometric properties. Often we start with something like testing scale reliability. Now, in the ordinary kind of meaning, reliability would equate to the word of dependability. So in a real life, you want to be dependent on a good car. You often are you depend on people around you for support. So this word is really saying that you may rely on your car, you rely on the people, you can trust those people. Now, in testing is similar connotation. It really just refers to how consistently and accurately the measure procedures produce similar or same results when we tested across different samples, across different times, or across different scorers. So it's about the extent that we can trust and depend on the results that this test is producing. Now, there are several types of scale reliability. Now, today, I only will reflect on the 2 most commonly used scale reliability tests. The first one is called internal consistency, or you may hear of this coefficient alpha or Cronbach's alpha. Now, this internal consistency evaluates each item and how well they contribute towards producing a result as being part of the multi-item scale. So in a simple words, how closely related those sets of items are as a group. Now, coefficients alpha is a value which ranges from 0 to 1. Now, closer to 1, the stronger Cronbach's alpha you have, the more to better scale reliability you have. Now, we want really high alpha, like 0.8 or 0.9, but we have to be very careful here, because if we aim for such a high scores, we may end up with items that are all redundant. They are saying everything in just different ways, same words but differently. So often we need to do a trade-off. We settle on something less than 0.7, just making sure that all our items represent the construct as a whole, rather than all saying the same thing slightly differently. Now, 0.7, when you have a look at the guidelines here for a Cronbach's alpha, would reflect a scale which is acceptable. Okay, acceptable scale reliability. Okay. So these ones are just a point of cautions. If you have got many items in a scale, you tend to have higher Cronbach's alpha. And if you have got 2 similar items in a scale, it will also artificially inflate the alpha level, and we need to be wary of that. The other test is called retest reliability. So we want a scale that will accurately show similar results when we use it with people over and over again. So we want to repeat the same results, and that's why we call it retest reliability, because we test it once with our sample and we test it again some time later. Now we have to decide what would be the best time lag for these 2 testing. Typically, you will see a lag between 2 to 8 weeks, but for some constructs, you will get away with much longer lag. I have seen scales with a 6 months or even 12 months retest reliability. Typically, we calculate the 2 sets of scores between those 2 times, and if we achieve strong or high Pearson's correlations, this would provide us with support for retest reliability. Now, where the scale reliability can be demonstrated through a coefficient, quite nice, a number, and we like numbers, that's not the same when we test scale validity. We don't have a clear cutoff points that would indicate that we have achieved scale validity. Often, these would be interpreted in papers as a weak, adequate, or strong validity. Now, scale validity is measuring the extent to which a test measures what it claims it to be measuring. So if we devise items and we think that those items are measuring self-esteem, do we have a trust and confidence that they in fact measure that construct? That's a scale validity. Now, validity is a central requirement for psychological tests. Without validity tests, we would end up with just some items that have no meaning. Not necessarily we would know what those items are measuring. And this is important because often we see quite reliable tests. So we made device items that produce reliable results, but they may not be valid if they are not measuring what we think that they should be measuring. So to have a valid test, it has to be both. It has to be valid as well as reliable. Now, there are many types of validities, and I include some of those on the screen. Really, you need to have a good combination to provide this cumulative evidence. And planning for this would start at the start of our scale development as we are trying to identify the nominological net for our construct. So we will start with face validity. Face validity just assesses the degree to which psychological tests appears effective in measuring what it claims to measure. So it presents very subjective opinion on the measure, often by the test taker. So it's not a formal test of validity. However, low validity, face validity, will have a serious implications on the use of the test and also completion of the test, because some participants may just refuse to participate on a survey or might not take it seriously if there is no face validity. As an example, if we are devising a scale of coping and the items reflected intimate relationships, and we give this to participants, they may feel, well, do these items make sense in a coping scale? Are they in any way related to measuring how we cope? Does it seem to be valid on a surface? Right? If it's not valid on a surface, then we will lose our test takers. They won't want to complete our scale. So face validity is actually quite important. The other one is content validity. This is a non-statistical type of validity which measures the extent to which measure and the items within represent the construct as a whole. So here we are looking at that content coverage of the construct. This happens at the start of test development. This is something that cannot be done retrospectively. Typically, it's demonstrated through our use of theory when we were reading about the construct and were identified different domains. It can be demonstrated through our test specification that we truly identify items that reflect that construct as a whole. We also use expert reviews to review our items and how adequately they reflect each of the domains. Okay? And we could also demonstrate it through acceptable content validity indices. Okay? So that's something that happens at the start of the test development process. And so to have content valid scale, for example, disposition of hope, which from reading should have two domains of goal-directed energy and planning to meet goals, we can say that we have a scale that is content valid if the items will reflect those two domains of disposition of hope adequately. Now let's move on to more of the statistical tests of validity or scale validity, starting with something called concurrent validity. Now, concurrent validity just measures the extent to which a certain measure or our measure correlates with another measure that we selected from our nominological net. And this is assessed by correlating those two measures collected at the same time. So in other words, we are taking our new scale and we correlate it with some real world criterion, real world outcome that we measure at the same time. So we do draw those constructs from the nominological net. So for example, in our self-esteem example, we might include scale measuring ability to cope. Okay. And if we get a correlation between those two measures that is are positive, then it would give us support for concurrent validity. So we are looking for the expected correlations in terms of the direction and strength. Now, similar one is called predictive validity, which is really measuring the extent to which our new scale can predict a score on another scale in the future. Now, to be able to do it, we would need longitudinal design so that we can assess those outcomes that happen in the future. So we may develop a new scale of recruitment, and we want to assess it in terms of it predicting on-the-job behaviors. Or we may develop a new scale of kind of forensic test, and we will correlate it with future offendings. And so something in the future. Again, these outcomes or criterions or correlates can be drawn from the nominological net. And if we find expected correlations in terms of direction and strength, again, it will provide us with the support for scale validity. Now, another type is called construct validity, and there are actually quite a few types of construct validity. Now, I will just cover two that are reported probably most commonly in articles, called convergent and divergent validities. In terms of the convergent validity, here this measures the extent to which our new measure of the construct is related to another measure that would be conceptually related. Okay, so typically and in practice, we would devise a new psychological scale of the construct, and then we would include another second already validated measure of the same construct in a questionnaire, and then we would assess their correlation. So if we have got two measures that are measuring similar or same construct, we would expect to have very strong positive correlations between these. And so if that's the case, it would give us support for convergent validity. The divergent validity just assesses the opposite. The extent to which a measure of a construct is not related to a construct that should not be related to theoretically. And so if we devise a new scale, so here I have a good example of self-esteem scale, and through reading, we know that this construct should not be related to other measures such as income. We will include income as a measure in our survey, and then we correlate this with our new self-esteem scale. Now, if we find correlation that is very low or is really no correlation between those two, this would give us support for divergent validity because we find something that is not related to that construct theoretically. Again, those measures will be drawn from our nominological net. And that's it in terms of providing or testing psychometric properties of a scale. The last and final step would just be to report the scale development exercise and hopefully to publish the paper in a peer-reviewed international journal. Now, there are many journals out there that are focusing on publishing scale development articles, and I included some of those journals here, such as Journal of Career Assessment or International Journal of Testing. In terms of the structure of the article, there are some differences. So we still would need to report on some background to our construct and would have to justify that a new scale is needed. Typically in methods, we would describe how we developed the scale, so all the processes. I also would have to report the results of our item reduction analysis and factor analysis. We would have to report on scale reliability and scale validity. And we would have to include our final sets of items somewhere. So typically you might see in text as a part of the factor loading table, or some developers choose to submit these items as a part of the appendix, where they also include instructions for the participants, the response option scale, and the items, as well as the instructions how to score that scale. Now, sometimes these tests are produced to be standardized tests, so for diagnostic purposes, and so then the developer would also write a manual for the test with information how to administer the test, how to score the test, and also these manuals would include norms and standardized norms. And that's it. I included some of the lecture resources for you if you are interested on scale development, construct validity and reliability, as well as content validity. Now, I am not sure how I'm doing with time. Vitri, are you happy if I go ahead with the example?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so we have got example. So, example of scale development. Now, this is from a published paper where I, back during my PhD, developed a scale of career calling for emerging adults. Now, this paper has been published in Journal of Career Assessment back in 2015, and I wrote it along with my then PhD supervisors, Professor Peter Creed and Associate Professor Michelle Hood. So how did I go and how did I apply those 10 steps to scale development? Well, the construct of my interest was called career calling. Now, back then, it was quite a new topic in career development psychology. And when I asked Australians about career calling, they couldn't tell me what career calling was. Well, so wasn't I. I didn't know what career calling was. And so I was reading and reading literature more and more on career calling. Now, my interest was in young adults who were preparing for their future career. And it seemed that this concept of career calling appeared to be relevant to this age group. Now, during my reading of the literature, I find out that I'm dealing with quite a complex constructs. I find many definitions are quite a few dimensions to career calling. And so it appeared that career calling was a multidimensional construct. During my literature review, I also reviewed existing scale of career calling, and specifically, I was after finding whether any of those existing scales would be appropriate to use with young adults who are preparing for future career. Well, what I find out that some of the existing scales were only unidimensional. Some of them even had less than 3 items in a scale. So how could they assess the career calling as a whole when the career calling appeared to be multidimensional? I also find out that some of the domains that were included were not relevant to Australians. These scales were predominantly developed in the US. In addition, the items in those scales seem to be written for adults that are already working, rather than for adults who are preparing for their future career. And so this review gave me good justification that I needed to develop a new multidimensional scale of career calling for young adults who are preparing for their future career. So what I did next was conducting focus groups with 12 young people. I wanted to explore what career calling meant to Australian young people and how that was manifested through their actions and thoughts and feelings. Specifically, I was listening for all the different phrases that the young people use when they were talking about calling and their goals. During this process, I identified three key aspects or domains of career calling relevant to this aged group. Now, I have decided on devising my definition of career calling, also driven by a goal setting perspective, because goal setting and career goal setting is very relevant to young people. And so I came up with my own definition where I included my 3 domains. I define it as a salient career goal that was personally meaningful, that was oriented towards helping others, and also involved engaging in some goal-directive career preparatory actions. During this exercise, I also identify nominological net of my career calling. So my career calling sits here in the middle with my 3 domains. And then these other are constructs that sit externally to my career calling. So these ones are other constructs that are either related positively, negatively, or not correlated at all, such as age and gender with my career calling. Then I devised the specification for the career calling based on which I wanted to develop my items. So I plotted my 3 domains here on top. Now, nowhere in the literature I read that one domain was more important than others, and so I gave them equal weights. I also included 3 manifestations. Also, I weighted them evenly. And then for me to develop items, for example, that reflected the domain of personal meaning and behavioral manifestation, I had to generate items that reflected career-related actions that led to personal growth. If I wanted to develop items that reflected other-oriented meaning and, for example, manifested through affects or emotions, I needed to devise items that reflected feelings of satisfaction, which was derived from helping others through one's career. Another example item for active engagement domain, which would be manifested through thoughts. These items need to reflect thoughts and cognitions that drove one's progress to its career goal, and one of them was feelings of inner urge. Okay? So this is how I needed to, I guess, complete the whole of the test specification. I needed to complete each of those cells. I need to generate items that reflect each of those cells in the test specification. Now I have to also decide about my sample size. So the aim was to come up with a brief scale of about 15 items. And so for this test specification, I generate 4 times that many items that I needed. So I was nerdy. I don't know why, but I ended up with 62 items based on this test specification, and this included both positive and negative items. Now, this poor cell here only has got 6 items, just because I just couldn't think of yet another item that would reflect active engagement manifested through thought, so just left it there. The next step was that I have conducted expert review on those 62 items. So I asked 6 experts in career development psychology and test construction to review my 62 items. Now, I only retain items which would have an individual item content validity index which equaled or was higher than 0.83. Now, what it meant that 5 out of 6 experts had to rate that item as adequate or something better for me to keep it. Now, based on this, I have deleted 10 items which had poor content validity. Now that would leave me with 52 items. Now, based on the guidelines of sample size, I would, if I administered these 52 items to participants, I would have to have like over 500 participants in my sample, so too many. So I needed to delete some more items. And so I went through and just left the best items in a scale. Based on that, I deleted another 18 items, which I thought were just too similar with other items that I created, or were too long or too complex. Just left my best items. Now that left me with 34 career calling items that I, after piloting, administered to a large sample. Now, I collected the data through online and pen and paper surveys. The questionnaire that I had included those 34 items, as well as demographic questions and a number of scale validity measures. So these would be measures that I draw from my Nominological Net of career calling. Now I end up with a very large sample size. I was lucky. So I was able to split the data into 2 samples. Now I did it randomly. The first sample was 345 young adults, and I used these for the initial item reduction analysis and exploratory factor analysis. And then the other sample, I use for confirmatory factor analysis and scale validation. Now, during my item reduction analysis, I actually didn't find any problematic item that would show poor distribution of scores across the items or showed any gender bias. And I also didn't find any problematic correlations in my items correlating with other items or the overall test. And so I still was left with my 34 items. So then I needed to use the exploratory factor analysis to delete the rest. Now I use principal access factoring because I thought that there's some kind of underlying structure to the items reflecting a latent or abstract construct of career calling. Now there are different criteria that I used to delete items. Now, there is something called scree plot, which is a graphical representation of my dimensionality, which suggested that I am having a 3-factor solution. Now, I was happy with it because it's exactly what I was predicted and how I create my items using test specification. I was happy with it. But I had lots of problematic items that either cross-loaded on a different factors or didn't show strong loading on a factors. And so I was able to delete 19 items from those 34. And I ended up with a final scale as I wanted, having 15 items. Now those 15 items have reflected 3 factors, which you can see in this table. And exactly how I envisaged this, 3 domains. Now, each of those domains ended up having a 5 items with strong factor loadings. Okay? So 5, 5, 5 means that I have even factors, and this is exactly what test specification suggests, that each domains were weighted evenly. Now, this scale had items that reflected those domains, so that would be demonstration of content validity. And it had excellent properties. So the scale and the items accounted for 62.93% of the variance. Now, probably doesn't mean too much to you, but it exceeds the target of 60% as suggested by Henkin back in 1998. Now, each of those factors end up being robust. It's because they explain each more than 5% of the variance. They also showed really good intertotal correlations with ranging from 0.50 to 0.71. That's what you would expect. They are not too low, they are not too high. And the scale came up with a Cronbach's alpha of 0.88. Now, according to the criteria for scale reliability, this would indicate good Cronbach's alpha. I also ran one for each of the domains, and they were also good. Now, with the new sample, I ran confirmatory factor analysis, which confirmed this structure, and in addition showed that those 3 factors loaded onto a second-order factor of career calling. Now, what it means that I could be quite confident that my scale was in fact multidimensional. In terms of scale validity, I have drawn measures from my Nominological Net. So see, these measures or this construct would be also the measures that I included in my survey. And so for convergent validity, I have selected conceptually similar measure called presence of calling. Now, the correlation was positive and strong, and it's exactly what you would expect in terms of convergent validity. I also use discriminant validity. I wanted to discriminate my scale of career calling with a search for calling. I would expect that correlation be negative, and it's exactly what I found. So it supported scale validity. For concurrent validity, I had two measures, career indecision and life satisfaction. So these would reflect the outcomes of career calling or correlates. Again, as expected, I found direction of the correlation as expected, and these were significant. Now, in other study later on, I was able to also demonstrate divergent validity. So this is when we test our scale against measures that should not be related to our measure theoretically. And I included age and gender in my Nominological Net. So I tested it and I find out correlations which were very low, not significant. So this would actually be a good evidence for divergent validity. Now, in another study, I was able to demonstrate predictive validity. So when I predict where career calling measured at one time, then predicted other variables at time two. So they predicted life meaning, goal-directed effort, and career adaptability. Now, the time lag for this was 6 months. And so it's a good outcome. Now, in the same study, I was also able to measure test-retest reliability because now I have a career calling administered to the same people twice on 2 occasions. Now, the correlations between those 2 occasions end up being 0.79, which indicates strong correlation. With 6 months, like this is excellent result for a scale. Now, what I want to demonstrate here and remind you that when it comes to scale validity, it is an ongoing process where you collect evidence from multiple small studies across different samples. It's never just one-off study, it's a cumulative evidence. And that's it. My step 10 was just write this exercise up, and I ended up writing a number of papers, and some of these are here on your slide. And that's all from me. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and hopefully you can get some information and get a little bit motivated, hopefully to develop scale for your honors or for your PhD project.
Okay. Thank you, Anna, for your great presentation.
Thank you.
We have several questions, Anna.
Okay. I have
so
to
I
open.
can read it. Yes, I can read it for you. The first one is from Jati. Jati is our colleague from Indonesia. She is now in the US, in Oklahoma, to have her PhD.
Excellent.
So here is her question. What is the rule of thumbs? How many items for each subscale in a multidimensional construct?
Okay, thank you, Jati. So I would say the rules of thumbs is to come up with at least 3 items per each domain. So if you get 5, it's even better. So anything between 3 to 5 items per each domain would be fine.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So yeah, 3 is the minimum. So maximum maybe 5.
Could be 5. You often see more, but it just depends on the different manifestation of the construct. So if it manifests through different ways, you might want to have extra items in there, but good rules of thumbs to go for 3 to 5 if we are after a brief scale.
Okay, so for a brief scale, we need 3 to 5 items. Thank you. So the next question is from Raihana. Thank you for the insightful lecture, Professor Anna. My name is Raihana.
It rhymes.
Yeah, and I am curious about scale updates. If someone wants to develop a more reliable scale of the same topic, how would one approach that? So how could they do this? Do we collaborate and consult, or do we simply credit insight? Furthermore, what is the general attitude about updating in the first place? Is it fine to research the same topics over and over again, or is it more encouraged for us to discover new topics? Thank you so much.
There's so many questions there. I think that if there is existing scale which is not showing good psychometric properties, or maybe just suiting different culture, even different culture, then I think it is okay to work on improving the scale. So that might involve generating new items that we think would be more relevant to our sample and our context, or maybe starting with the items of the existing scales, maybe improve them or even keep them. But we always have to acknowledge the authorship of those items if they come from different scales.
Okay, yeah. Do we need to collaborate with that person who developed the original scale, Anna?
I think that's always a good idea to contact the authors of the original scales, because they might lead to collaborative work for the future as well. So that networking is very important there. I think that's a good, I guess, good practice as well, to let somebody know, this is what I'm working on. If you have got any suggestion, I would welcome these.
Okay, thank you. So Dr. Anna is happy to have you to collaborate with her in developing a career calling skill in Indonesia.
I think that there was one already.
Okay. Okay. Next is from, so there is no name in here. Hello, Dr. Anna. Thank you for your explanation. I want to ask you some question. First, is it okay if the respondents of our items are our relatives, or it will cause a bias? And my second question is, what if the respondents are not consistent with what he or she feel when she or he fill in the scale? So for example, he filled the item of I understand my life's meaning with absolutely true, but then he filled the item my life has no clear purpose also with absolutely true. Thank you and sorry for any grammatical errors.
Like I can tell in Indonesia. So what was the first part? I forgot.
Is it okay if our respondent or participants of our research are
relatives.
our relatives?
Well, that's interesting one. I always get my husband to to complete my surveys. Well, that would be more about the ethical issues of using our relatives as potential participants. So I would say some of the ethics boards might not be too happy with us asking relatives, because they might be considered vulnerable groups. So some of those that we might potentially overuse. So other groups may be like little children, or members of a specific groups that might have the tendency to be overused for survey purposes. So that's more an ethical issue. I think if that it's the construct as well, is or the topic of the survey would probably also in consideration whether it's suitable or not to involve our participants. Sometimes some surveys may be a little bit more sensitive and might uncover things that perhaps this respondent doesn't want the researcher to know about, so it might actually create issues within the family. So my advice would be, don't use your family as your participants if you can help it. But I do use my husband to proofread my surveys.
Thank you. So it really depends on the topics or content of the scale, right? And
I would say so. I would say so. If you as a researcher feel that asking these questions your family may be problematic, if you have the sixth sense, then it probably will be problematic.
okay.
If you have got a quite some general topic, it might not be that that problematic, as long as we are not overusing them every week, getting them to complete a survey, because ethical board would not be happy with us as the researchers.
Okay, so it is also important to note that we cannot overuse a group of people. For example, someone from different classes or someone freshman always get a new scale to try on.
Definitely, first-year psychology students are students that are typically overused, especially if they need to participate for a credit in their degrees as well. So first years are the classic sample of students or pool of students that may be overused. So that's why ethical boards are so, kind of take it as a very important consideration when they look at our sample.
Okay, thank you. And then what if the respondents are not consistent with their answer?
Well, I think that they should be consistent unless, so in some scales, so I guess one potential thing is if that we don't have a consistency in responding, that we are dealing with respondents that are not paying attention to our items. So that would be more a response bias from our participants. But I wonder, wherever this is the question, I think that question that if you have got items and some of the items may create a little bit of conflict. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think that all of these scales would then, so when we do analysis with the scales like that, we don't use the items and we don't analyze the items individually. We typically aggregate those items into form some global measure of that construct. And so I think that actually would not be problematic.
So we also need to see the situation when administering the scale, right? Whether the person is in a good condition or in a good health or can concentrate with what they do.
And I guess this is something that I didn't speak in the lecture, is sometimes into the survey we embed questions which we call like questions or a check question, where we just can put an item somewhere, especially when our surveys are long. So somewhere in the middle and maybe towards the end, we may include some of those check questions. Tick, disagree if you are still attentive at this point. So so they have nothing to do with the survey itself, but if the participant doesn't respond accurately to how we say, it might pick these participants that at that stage might lacking attention.
Okay, so students, you can add one question. If you have long question in the scale, you can add one question. The question doesn't relate to the content of the scale, but just to check whether the participant is still with you or not. So I'm still concentrating in doing this scale.
That's right.
Strongly agree. And if he doesn't respond very well, it means that he doesn't pay attention. He doesn't pay full attention.
And we often then delete those participants from our sample. We don't use them because they have the potential to introduce an error into our data, and we don't want them. So we would be dealing with the issues of response bias from our participants. If we can identify those participants, we typically just delete them. The other issue we often have with responding are getting participants that provide us with socially desirable responses. And so they give us responses in a way they think that we want them to respond. And so for them, we can include something called like questions. So we might include some meta questions such as, I never lie. So that's one of those things that we typically lie at least once in our lifetime. And so if we have good participants that agree or strongly agree that I never lie in my lifetime, it might actually pick a participants that are prone to social desirable responding. And we might actually delete those participants as well.
Okay, thank you. So we can delete that kind of participant, because
That's
it will disturb our data.
That's
so
right.
I will move to the students who are in this MS Teams who can ask you question, and then I will go back to the question from the chat. So I can ask you here, students, Hanifa or Glenn or Juve or Muhammad Fakih, you can ask question.
Can I be first, please?
Yes, Glenn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Open cam, Miss?
Yes. Can you
Okay.
please turn on the camera?
Okay. Okay. Hello.
Hello, Glenn.
Miss Hannah. Okay. My name is Glenn, Miss Hannah.
Nice to meet you.
It is great to meeting you today. So my question is regarding to your journal mentioned about a further limitation is that many existing measures are indimensionals, whereas career calling is multidimensional construct. Is it right? So my understanding is there are many different models of calling have been proposed, but we do not know how much research results that refer to specific model are generalizable to differentiate theoretical accounts of callings. So the point is the point of my question is will it be possible whether two leading models of calling tackle the same construct, ma'am? Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Vitri, can you
Glenn, maksudnya tadi berarti if there is a scale career calling, is it possible for us to develop to know how can we know how many research that somebody else have already been doing so far?
Okay,
yeah, to know that.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, look, it takes lots of work of doing a literature review. So assessing some of the relevant journals, such as the ones that are relevant to career development. Okay, so things like a Journal of Career Assessment, Journal of Vocational Behavior. There are different journals out there that are reporting. I typically start with something like Google Scholar, where to help me identify some of the key people in the area. And then I use them to go back into specific journals to look for that original paper. So it's okay to start with a Google Scholar to identify the big people and potentially the most recent articles like 2019, 2020 papers. Then go find them and go into the references, because they will identify all the other people that have already done work on career calling. And there are actually a number of review papers on career calling. And I think the last one was published, I think, last year. So those review papers are excellent because it provides you with a summary of what has already been done on career calling.
So Glenn, you can have a literature review in Journal of Career Development, International Journal of Vocational and Educational Behavior, maybe, or Journal of Career Assessment, or any related journal. So you can understand how many studies that have been doing so far by other researchers regarding career calling. Is that what you are asking? Is there any other question?
Okay. There is a point is like if the two models of theoretically like callings were merged into a comprehensive framework, will it has different outcomes?
So I know. So if we find different kinds of theoretical framework from different experts, for example, someone explained that career calling consists of 3 domains, and someone else stated that career calling, consists of 5 domains, something like that. How can you conclude that, and how can you have a comprehensive understanding regarding that?
Glenn, it's a hard work, Glenn, to do it, and often it needs a very good judgment by the researcher. So specifically for me, I was looking at all of them. And it took me almost a year of my PhD to identify everything that was written on career calling, including the different definitions and domains. I ended up creating a big table where I have plotted all the different perspectives and definitions and domains, and then I've done something called content analysis, almost trying to figure out the common elements of the definitions and the domains. And so I then use the ones that I guess were most commonly used by the different theorists. And I synthesized them into my own view. If
Yes.
that makes sense. That's different ways you can do it. It's not easy way when there is so much written on that construct. It's lots of hard work and also anxieties that you might have missed something along the line. But it's all just hard work and plotting it and find out a way how you can synthesize this. There is no way you can identify every element of that construct, especially as some of those perspectives are quite different to one another. You know, when you have got a construct that doesn't have kind of a universal definition, it is always hard to do it. So it's about considering what the sample that you want to work with. Are they young people? Are they working people? Are they elderly? And what domains and part of the definitions may be relevant to that sample.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Glenn.
You're welcome.
So when we are doing literature review, I just remember when I was doing my PhD back in 2010, we came to the office every day from 7:30 to 5.
Yep.
Every day just to read the literature so that we can have ideas. So the students here are also creating a new scale, but this is only for their task assignment.
Good.
So they need also to read every day from 7 to 5 as a full-time student, so that they can create something new. Okay, thank you, Glenn. Maybe we can discuss it later in the classroom if you like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. Great questions.
Next, Juve.
Thank you so much.
Time is yours, Juve.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mrs. Anna and everyone. Hello. Thank you, Mrs. Anna, for the clear explanation.
Thank you.
It's Jiverio Pangestu from class 4. I have two questions. My first question is, in step 3, developing items, how do we know which areas or manifestation have a greater importance than others? And second question, is there any deficiency of response format for choice tip? And because there are only between yes or no, as far as I know, sometimes there are people who want to answer items that are neutral, but the response format cannot be applied. Does it will affect the result or measurement process? Thank you for the time.
Yes,
that's great.
Thank you, Juve.
Great question. So the first one was about how we identify how important are our manifestations or domains. So again, quite interesting question. So it all will stem from the literature review that you do. So when you read about that construct of your interest, you will find out that some of the definitions may stress some of the domains more than the others. And so that might indicate that those particular domains are more important. They may be greater consensus between the researchers on some of the domains, while other domains may only be spoken by a number of researchers, but you think that it's important, so you include it, but wait a little bit less. Now, when it comes to the manifestations, again, it will be driven from your literature review. And specifically, if you decide to speak to people that may represent the population, they will tell you, wherever they think, wherever that manifests in actions, the way how they speak will highlight so that some of the manifestation may be more important than others. Now, if there is nothing in the literature, then I would suggest to keep all the domains and manifestations even.
Okay, is it clear, Juve? You can search in the literature, yeah? Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank
for the
you.
second question, what about the natural option for the choice?
Look, in my own research, I tend to not include that middle point because I want my participants to work harder when they respond to the questions, and I want them to polarize themselves on one side or the other. But literature and books will tell you that the midpoint is very important because we have to give our participants the choice to select that middle point. Okay, so I would say the choice is yours. Okay? I think when we look at the research that looked at the comparing those odd and even scales, they didn't find much difference between them.
Okay, thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Mrs. Anna.
You're welcome.
Thank you, next question is from Hanifa or Muhammad Fakih. Do you have any question for us? For Anna?
Excuse me?
Yes. Can you please turn on the video?
So I'm Hanifa from Psychological Measurement Class 2.
Hello.
I actually had two questions, but one of them has already been asked by Juve.
Oh, I see. That's okay.
It's okay.
But I have another one, and it's like sometimes, according to my experience in creating items, sometimes simplifying a sentence of an item can cause, ambiguous.
Okay.
Instead. So what can we do to avoid both complicated sentence and ambiguous at the same time? Thank you.
Thank you, Hanifa. It's very interesting question. Now, I actually don't know Indonesian. So I only know English and Czech. It is typically in a choice of words. So what makes even a short item ambiguous is some word inside that may cause participants to lack clarity. So items should be as specific as possible and use very specific words that are not informal or colloquial in some way. I think that the key is to really have your items reviewed by experts, by your supervisors, and also pilot those items with the representative sample, because they will tell you if there is something wrong with the items. And you always create more items at the start than you need at the end. So all of those poor items will be weeded out anyway in the process. So if you develop a number of poor items, you will delete them later on just to set with your best set of items at the end.
Okay, is it clear, Hanifa? Yeah, so you need expert review, yeah?
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you, Hanifa. So we will have Muhammad Fakih. Can you turn on your video, Muhammad Fakih? Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you for the lecture, Professor Anna.
You're welcome.
I'm gonna ask something, but I think you already answered it, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. So how do we identify if our items were answered correctly by our research population? And what should we do if they don't answer it correctly?
Yeah. Yes. So what can we do? So I would say first, number one would be to try to make your survey as short as possible. So if you have got a short surveys, and that means that the participants will hopefully answer all of those questions while they are paying full attention to it. So 5-minute survey, 10-minute survey is okay. But anything which is longer than 20 minutes will start to bore or tire our participants, and they may start to just lose the attention, just incorrectly responding to it, or may just not even complete our survey to start with. They may just leave, So that would be a number one. Try for a shorter survey. And then I already said we can include some of those check questions. Are you still alert? Towards the end of the survey. If they don't respond that correctly, it will identify we have got a participants which are not paying attention, who may be already tired, and we may delete them. Okay. We might have issues with participants, something called acquiescence. I'm not sure whether you have heard of this term, but these ones are participants that agree with everything. So they will just go and agree with all items from top to the bottom of the survey. So that would identify another problem with responding by our participants. Now, if we find a person like this, which just agrees with everything from top to the bottom, and it doesn't make sense, then this would be a problematic participant. We would typically delete that participant because they will introduce lots of error into our data. Okay.
Thank
So
you.
hopefully that answered your question.
It does.
Thank you, Fakih,
You're
untuk pertanyaannya. Great questions, students. Thank you very much for your questions.
Very nice
And
questions.
from the chat, we still have, maybe I can make a simple question for you. How can we make sure that there won't be any biases that will make the participant choose somewhere in disagree when actually they do agree? So maybe how can we make sure that participant give the right answer? That's from Cut Jihan salah satunya.
So some of my suggestions is when you are setting your surveys, and that might include different scale items of different scales, a good way is to mix the response options up. That's fine. One agree to disagree, one from never to always. But one thing to remember, make sure that you keep your polarity the same, so that all the items, the lowest number means lowest level of that construct, and the highest number on the scale means highest level of the construct. If we start mixing polarity of our response options, then it will produce some of the problematic responding. People will just tick the response on the right hand side of the response when they should in fact respond on the left. I don't know if that's clear.
Okay, thank you. That's clear, I think. So next question is from Taskia. What if we got limited literature and access for the literature? What will you do, Dr. Anna?
What would we do? Well, if there is not literature on a construct, it's probably not good start with a survey or a psychological measurement. Probably the first step, if there is nothing written on a construct, would be perhaps to do a bit of qualitative research, where we want to ask participants what that constructs mean to them. So that would be a stage where we would collect information on that topic. Okay? So and this would typically start any research on the topic which is we don't know anything about. We would start with qualitative research when we create this information, and hopefully later on we can use this information to create measurements, to measure that construct and then use it in a future research.
Okay, thank you. So you can have a focus group discussion and then interview with the expert
That's
as well.
right. That's
So
right.
next is, do you have any suggestion how to brainstorm our mind so we can be more productive in generating item? So is there any tips or trick for you to be more productive in generating items?
Productive in generating items.
Yeah.
I would what I do with my students, because I also teach psychological assessments here, and my students create scales and that kind of stuff. I find that it's more productive if I get students to work in groups where they can brainstorm the ideas of the wording of the items, and else the kind of the peer support and collaboration with other people is the key to it. Sometimes some of the test specification cells are quite difficult to create items. That means that it will be harder for us to create items for those specific cells in the test specification. Sometimes we need to discuss this with other people to help us create those items. And I would say if you have good people around you, it will make you more motivated and productive.
Okay, thank you. And then what if we find something, questionnaire that is not familiar to us because it has been derived from foreign language? So what will we do as a participant if we face something like that?
So I think this shouldn't really happen. So I think when we design the research and we select the measures that to include in our study, we have to review all the items in the study and see whether all the items are relevant to our sample. And very often what we do, specifically if we translate scale that has been devised in a US or somewhere else and we want to use it in our country, we might actually modify some of those items to be more relevant and better understood by our sample in our country. So it is okay to modify scales that have been used or developed somewhere else to make sure that we don't deal and face issues with our participants responding to those items.
Okay, thank you for your question. Maybe we will have a look at the meeting chat later after my presentation. Thank you, Anna. You can have rest and maybe you can follow this.
I will. I cannot wait. And thank you for all the great questions. I can relax now and let you work with students now.
Okay, thank you. And students, halo semuanya. Ini saya coba untuk mempresentasikan bagian saya ya. Sebentar lagi. Oke. Apakah bisa dilihat sekarang? Atau belum bisa?
Saya belum lihat, Bu.
Belum lihat ya.
Baru lihatnya di ini, file manager ya.
Terus ini gimana ya caranya? Oke. Oh, baru di file manager ya. Kalau sekarang? Sekarang?
Ya, lagi proses sepertinya.
Oke.
Ya, sudah tampak.
Sudah tampak? Oke. Sudah tampak. Ini sekarang sudah kelihatan ya?
Sudah.
Kalau sekarang sudah kelihatan berganti slide-nya? Sudah, oke.
Tapi belum slideshow ya?
Oh, belum slideshow. Sekarang sudah slideshow kah?
Butuh waktu ternyata.
Butuh waktu ya. Oke. Sekarang sudah slideshow apa belum? Belum ya.
Saya
belum.
Oke.
Sudah
ya. Oke, thank you very much for the time for me to present my presentation right now. So students ini nanti and all the lecturers, we are trying to use English as much as possible, but it is also okay if we later we can use bahasa Indonesia if you like to have question in Indonesia too. So because we are now we now have a guest from outside Indonesia, so we will really appreciate her presence here. So I will use English. I will share my experience and my article about the adolescent parent career congruence scale. So this is from my article in 2013 about adolescent parent career congruence scale. So this is part of my publication during my study in 2010 to 2013. I begin with my interests. Can you see the pictures here, Mbak Novi? The role of parents in adolescent career development?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when I searched the literature, I found that the role of parents in adolescent career development are very, very prominent. So first, they can give the adolescent direction, can be the role model, and can give approval, and also give expectation. Parents can also give recognition and guidance, and they also give advice to their children, and parents are also sources of support for their adolescent children. So especially in career development area, parents usually has an expectation for their adolescent children. I also have looked at the theory, so I found the interactionist approach in adolescent career development, and I found that in the microsystem, which is the immediate environment, I found that parents hold a very important role in their children's career development. So Bronfenbrenner ecological system theory described this kind of relationship is just like a ping pong. So when you play ping pong, you hit the ball and then your partner responded, hit it back to you, and you hit the ball again and again. So that is like the relationship between adolescent and their parents when they are in a family. So it's like a ping pong. So it means that when your parent has an aspiration and expectation for you, so you will respond that kind of expectation. And when you you show or demonstrate your ability, your self-efficacy, your parents' expectation is actually subject to change. But that's a little bit different in Indonesia because we have like high power distance index. So the adolescent needs to respect their parents, and the weight of their parents' advice is really big. So it is important for adolescents to obey their parents, usually like that. So when I see and search for the literature, I found that there are several previous measures capturing the idea of adolescent parent congruence or discrepancy. For example, in the career decision scale, that is from Osipo Carney Barak in 1976. That's even I haven't born. I wasn't born at that time. Yeah. So this is a scale which measures indecisiveness of individual. So disagreement with parents is one of the source of indecisiveness in individual. I also found the idea or items regarding adolescent parent congruence or discrepancy or incongruence in career decision-making difficulties questionnaire, for example. So the discrepancy between adolescent and parent serve as a source of difficulties for students in making a career decision. I found as well in the current career decision inventory, my vocational situation, and also career barriers inventory, that disagreement between adolescent and parent regarding career matters can be barriers for adolescent to make decision for their future career. And then middle school career decision making self-efficacy scale, vocational outcome expectation scale revised, and then living up to parental expectation inventory. Next, when I study the literature, there is literature from the organizational area. The name of the variable is person organization fit. So it consists of complementary fit and supplementary fit. So when I consult with my primary supervisor, Professor Peter Creed, he said that this might be useful for me to read the person organization fit idea and use it in the adolescent parent setting, so that I can develop a concept of adolescent parent career congruent based on person organization fit. So in person organization fit, so someone here as an employee has a good fit with their organization. So the demands of the organization, so the person can live up to the expectation of the organization, and the organization can give facilitation or supply or support for the individual as a worker. And supplementary congruence, the worker has the same value, has the same aspiration, has the same vision with their organization. So I apply the person organization fit idea into the career setting, especially in the context of adolescent parent relationship. So I develop complementary congruence as a demands ability congruence and need supply congruence. So I define it as ability for the individual to live up to their parents' expectation, and for the need supply congruence is how far the parents can support their children's career exploration and planning. For the supplementary congruence, how far the children can have similar career interest and aspiration with their parents. So in phase 1, item development, so this is, I do the same steps as what Anna do. So I review the literature, and then I did a series of 4 focus groups discussion. So me, I am the first author on Indonesian National, conducted the focus groups. I have 3 groups, 2 mixed gender groups and 1 group of girls only, and 1 of boys only, with 29 year 10 students. So year 10 students, it means like kelas 1 SMA. So it consists of 11 boys and 18 girls aged 15 to 16 years from a state high school in Central Java, Indonesia. So then we generated 30 items which were written in English and included both positively and negatively worded items to minimize monotony and response set bias. So I expect to have like favorable and unfavorable items. In Indonesia, you may be more familiar with that kind of words, yeah, favorable and unfavorable items. So, and all items were then shown to 4 independent reviewers. So I have 4 independent reviewers, English-speaking reviewers, who had expertise in career development and test development. They were asked to rate the suitability of each item to tap a particular domain of the construct and to comment generally on the items as to their phrasing and readability. And then we remove 10 items that were considered redundant, overlapping, or irrelevant. And we leave a final list of 20 items consisting of 15 positively worded items or favorable items and 5 negatively worded items or unfavorable items. Then we use the parallel back translation procedure to convert this 20 item into the Indonesian language. So from English to Indonesia, and other person convert from Indonesian to English, and then I compare the original English version with the later English version. And when I found inaccuracies, and then I revise that item, so then I can have the Indonesian version. And for phase 2, item analysis and exploratory factor analysis, I do this stage to identify items to be retained in the skill using item analysis and exploratory factor analysis. So I involve 1,062 year 10 students from 3 middle socioeconomic status, state high schools in Semarang, Central Java, Indonesia. So we divided this large sample into 2 subsamples using a random split procedure in the SPSS. So sample A consists of 550 students and sample B consists of 512. So I use the system to separate the data. And then I use the 20 items generated in phase 2. And the adolescents were asked to respond to each item using a Likert type format with options that range from 1 to 6, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And I administered the 20 items along with skills, tapping, parental support, living up to parental expectation, and life satisfaction, which were used to test for construct validity and are reported in phase 3. The survey was administered by teachers and the first author in class time at school. And the study was conducted with approval from the author's University Ethics Committee at the time, University Ethics Committee. And both parents and students gave their permission for the students to participate because the students, most of the students are less than 17 years old. So prior to the data collection, a parent or guardian signed a consent form agreeing to their child participation in the study, and the study signed and the child signed his or her own consent form. And children who did not take part in the study were set another activity by the class teacher. For the item analysis, first we assess item skew, like what Dr. Anna did, and then second, we examine the inter-item correlation to identify any pairs of item and to examine the redundancy. So third, we examine the corrected item total, so item and the total. We correlate that to identify any items with weak or negative correlation, and then we compare boys and girls. In this process, no items were identified as problematic. Thus, no items were removed as a result of the item analysis in this stage. So we did the exploratory factor analysis. In the first exploratory factor analysis, we found that the 5 negatively worded items, which contains items from both the complementary and supplementary domains, loaded onto a single factor. So we found that the unfavorable items itu bergerombol menjadi satu domain yang secara teoritis tidak bisa dibuktikan. So the 5 unfavorable item are grouped in separate group, so which is not related to the theory. As this result was likely to reflect a context-dependent item set for the negatively worded items. So the item co-vary because of an underlying contextual influence that of negative wording and not reflect a genuine independent factor. The five items were deleted from the analysis. So I deleted the unfavorable items because the item are grouped in separate group and we cannot explain it theoretically. When I check the literature, for example, from Halidina 1992, Higgins-Zumbo and Hay 1999, and so many researches using unfavorable item, I found that the unfavorable item are usually grouped in separate group that is not theoretically can be explained by our theory. So I deleted the 5 items. And then in the second exploratory factor analysis, I ran this exploratory analysis again, and I found 15 positively worded items. I used the 15 positively worded item, and subsequent to this analysis, 3 items were removed from the solution as the factor loadings were less than 0.4 and or less than twice as strong as on the appropriate factor as on the other factor. So I deleted items which have a low loading factor, and the remaining 12 items accounted for 57.6% of the variance. So I have the final 12 items. So here is the items. This is the factor 1, complementary congruence, and factor 2, supplementary congruence. So you see the bold numbers here. My parents encouraged me to explore the career areas I am interested in. That's its complementary congruence. My parents support me in my career plans. My parents show me how to get the information I need for my career interest, blah, blah, blah. And then for the supplementary congruence, my parents and I have the same way of defining career success. So I have all these items in Indonesia too. So maybe you can use it someday in your research. And for phase 3, I did some confirmatory factor analysis. The aim of this phase was to confirm the factor structure of the adolescent parent career congruence scale on sample B. So I used the data from sample B, 512 students, and I used the 12 item scale, and the result, I found that all the fit indices were good. Yeah, I used the AMOS graphic. So from this confirmatory factor analysis, 7 items are in complementary congruence and 5 items are in supplementary congruence. I also did the second order confirmatory factor analysis just to demonstrate that those 2 aspects load into one big construct congruence. And I also tried the one factor CFA, but it led to poor result. This demonstrated that 2 factor scale is better than 1 factor scale. So phase 4, I did the construct validity. I correlate adolescent parent career congruence scale with scales of parental support scale, and then living up to parental expectation scale, and also life satisfaction scale. So this is the correlation. So the alpha are good for all of the subscales I use, and the correlation is as expected. Sorry. So adolescent parent career congruence scale is positively correlated with life satisfaction scale, and also parental influence subscale, and also living up to parental expectation academic achievement subscale. So for the discussion, I think I concluded that congruence was defined as the perceived compatibility, adolescent perceived parents as meeting career exploration planning and goal setting needs, and perceived parents to be satisfied with their career progress, and similarity between adolescent and their parents. Adolescent perceive that parents possess similar or matching belief regarding career interests, values, plan, and goals. The result of the study show that the newly developed 12-item adolescent parent career congruence scale can be used to assess 2 aspects of congruence, namely complementary congruence and supplementary congruence. So we assess the content validity and then construct validity, and hopefully further evidence of construct validity can be tested in diverse sample. So given that academic achievement is closely related to career development, we expected that it is important also for researchers to develop a similar scale for the academic domain. maybe adolescent parent academic congruence scale, something like that. I think that's for the adolescent parent career congruence scale. I also developed different scale, but maybe you can read by yourself next time. The perceived research environment scale. Here is the scale. The scale is developed specifically for academics untuk dosen. The factors the scale consists of 5 factors: beneficial social relationship. For example, at my university, academics are willing to involve their colleagues in research project. At my university, academics support one another in the research project. That's beneficial social relationship. And then factor 2, positive reinforcement. For example, my university is well known for its research expertise, etc. Support, for example, my university has specific program and funds to help new academics get their research started. So this is all of these are the experience of academics regarding their environment, whether their environment are research supportive or not. I have also one more article in scale development. It is this is about the individual parent career goal discrepancy scale. In this scale, we have like 15 items. It consists of 3 factors: ability, choice, and enthusiasm. So the first one, I don't think I can meet the requirement for the career my parents want for me. That's the ability. So the students don't have enough ability to live up to their parent expectation. So the discrepancies regarding choice, for example, my parents believe that my own career choice is not good enough. And for enthusiasm, I am not seriously trying to achieve the career my parents want for me. I think that's it. So if you don't mind, Anna, I show the audience about our pictures. This is in 2013 when I submitted my thesis, and we celebrated with our friends and also our supervisor. I think that's it for my presentation. Maybe we can come back to the MS Teams. Okay, so there are several questions for Anna actually. Maybe we can read the questions, and maybe before that we can have also question from our lecturers. Is there any question from Mbak Agustin, Mbak Novi, or Mbak Dini and Mbak Lucy? Is there any question? Maybe you can ask directly to Anna. No question?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So we read the question from the chat to Anna before we discuss more. From Jati again, yeah. For example, we do not have enough items in specific subscale when developing scale. My question is, do we need to create the new one to fulfill the missing piece? If yes, what are the procedures to test this? If no, what condition that considered as acceptable? Yeah, Anna?
Very good question. Thank you, Jati. Such interesting questions that you have. Depends on your time and how much time you have with your study. So if you think that some of your domains may be underrepresented by your items and you have got a time and a leisure to do it, you may go back and develop new items and start the process again. But typically, we don't have the leisure of time. We have to move on. So often, what we have is what we report, and we suggest improvements for future research. We might also just decide if we end up only with 1 or 2 items in a domain. We may just decide to sacrifice the domain and just report that that domain has not been represented through exploratory factor analysis or confirmatory factor analysis. And it just suggests that there needs to be more work on the scale into the future.
Okay, Anna, thank you. So if the domain is weak, so yeah, we just delete that kind of domain, yeah?
We can, but I have seen so many scales. So you would have seen lots of scales being developed out there. It doesn't mean that all of those scales are good scales. And so often you see scales that only report 2 items in a domain. I have seen that happening. So obviously you as a critical reviewer of scales, because you have got all the knowledge about scale development now, you would identify that this is not a strong factor. But sometimes they do get published as well. You may just decide to sacrifice that domain and report what you have.
Okay, yes. And then maybe you can discuss it in your manuscript, right? You use 2 items because of blah, 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 something like that. Thank you.
You would start with the research review, with literature review that will suggest this one should be part of your study. You may find out that statistically it doesn't end up factoring that well. And so it gives you a great opportunity to discuss some of those things as part of your discussion in a research report or in your paper.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So there's a question from Fitria. So how to find participants? So I want to ask that when we conduct a test to people, there is a probability that they don't want to fill our scale or they don't want to complete our scale. And other side, we need a lot of sample to fill in the scale. Is there any solution from you?
There is no solution as such. Sample size, it's something that we will probably have more and more issues to get hold of. Universities may include first year pool for students that are seeking credits. We made, I don't know how it is in Diponegoro University, but in my university, we can send all university-wide emails to everyone in the university in an anonymous way. So we get quite a good sample size from those avenues. We typically post our research on our social media. So we have good at Facebooks and LinkedIn and ResearchGate and other websites that might actually be more specific to the sample which we are after. So we may be after specific group of people and they may be collaborating in a specific online group. And so if we gain approval, we may be able to advertise the study through those channels as well. But sample size is something that we always struggle with, especially when it comes to scale development, where ideally we want to have a sample size which exceeds 1,000 participants, so that like what your dean has done, has split the sample into several subsets and run those different studies based on that.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Oh, I think we can use online survey, right? I think, yeah, we don't have to have like a hard copies. So this last question. Hi, I am Angelina Gabriela. Thank you for your sharing today. And my question is, can you share to us the biggest obstacle that you have ever had in doing skill development and how you overcome it? And maybe you can give some motivation to us as the university student about how important to develop new skills instead of keep using the old ones that already existed. Thank you so much.
That's a lovely question. Well, I think it's always motivational when you can develop your own scale and when you can call it a name. So when I work with my students, I start them with saying, well, how do you want to call your name? Because once you put a name to your scale, you own the scale. Also, if you can develop a scale and items, it makes you an expert in scale development. It's something to remember because there are not many people around the world that are truly competent in developing good scales. So having this background knowledge and being able to apply it step by step should be really motivational to you. And some of my students that I supervise currently are also developing scales within their career development area, and they are really enjoying the exercise. I'm not sure how to motivate you guys. I think that if you can put your name on something that you own is motivational enough. And then hopefully other researchers will uptake that scale and will use it for their future research as well.
Yes. So when you devise a scale, you put your name on it, yeah. Yes. I think that is really good questions for students. Is there any more question or is it enough? Enough, yeah? So thank you, Anna, for your lecture today. Maybe Agustin will have a closing for today. Silakan, Mbak Agustin.
Thank you.
Hello, Anna.
Hello again.
Thank you for your presentation and your detailed explanation for us. I think the students very happy because it's easy to follow your explanation like that. Thank you, Mrs. Witri, for your sharing about the study, and thank you for the student join this activity today. Oke, terima kasih semuanya.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih semuanya. Saya akan menutup untuk kegiatan pada siang hari ini. Semoga apa yang kita pelajari pada hari ini bisa bermanfaat. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu dosen yang ikut dalam kegiatan pada siang hari ini juga. Tadi ada Ibu Jati dan ibu-ibu pengampu dari mata kuliah pengukuran. Terima kasih. Dan mahasiswa yang ikut sampai akhir untuk perkuliahan pada siang hari ini. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Anna, for your time and for your lecture and good explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
See you again.
Thank you, Anna.
See you again,
Anna.
See you everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Mbak Yana.
Novi dan semuanya.
Terima kasih Mbak. Terima kasih Mbak Agustin.
Sami-sami.
Bapak Ibu, Pak Pras, Mbak Lucy, Mbak Dini, Mbak Wiwit. Dan Juve, Hanifa, serta Glenn dan Muhammad Fakih. Makasih ya.
Sama-sama.
Semuanya yang sudah berpartisipasi aktif.
Terima kasih kembali Bu.